My husband left me barefoot in the freezing dark, thinking the snow would finish what his cruelty began. But I survived. And when I came back, I brought the winter with me. What happened next wasn't forgiveness. It was justice written in ice, silent, slow, and unstoppable. Before continue, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you. My name is Clara Morgan. I'm 38 years old, and I used to believe winters were beautiful. I thought the snow made the world quiet, so you could hear your own heartbeat. Now I know better. Silence is not peace. It's the sound of everything dying slowly. That night, Frostvale was buried under a sky that looked bruised and heavy. The thermometer on our porch shivered at -30 degrees. The air itself felt like glass ready to shatter. Inside, the fire had gone out hours ago, though I hadn't noticed. I was too busy arguing with a man who had already stopped listening. His eyes were calm, almost empty, the way a lake looks before it freezes over. When he told me to leave, I didn't understand at first. My body moved before my brain caught up. One second I was standing in the hallway, and the next I was outside barefoot, sweaterless, my breath turning to crystals in front of me. The door clicked shut behind me, and the sound echoed through the night like a final verdict. The first step hurt. The second one didn't. After that, pain turned into something dull, almost peaceful. The snow felt like knives against my skin, but the deeper I walked into the yard, the quieter everything became. The stars blurred above me, the world dimmed at the edges, and my heart began to slow its frantic beating. Somewhere far away, I could still see the warm light of our house glowing through the curtains. That house had held 12 years of my life, every laugh, every tear, every piece of myself I had carved away to keep him comfortable. Now it stood there, calm and golden, pretending I had never existed. The cold crept up my legs like a living thing. My toes turned numb, then my hands, then the rest of me. The ground tilted slightly as I tried to take another step. The snow was knee-deep, and I sank with every move, each breath sharper than the last. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was dissolving into the storm, part of it swallowed whole. I remember looking up one last time and seeing my reflection in the window, pale, shivering, unrecognizable. A ghost staring back. I collapsed near the mailbox. The world tilted again, but this time it stayed that way. I could taste metal in my mouth, maybe blood, maybe cold air. I thought about the promises he once made, how love had turned into something heavy and cruel. My mind tried to remember warmth, the smell of coffee in the mornings, his laughter echoing down the hallway, but even memories froze out there. Time stopped meaning anything. The sky faded from black to gray, and I was certain that was how my story would end, another nameless tragedy swallowed by the snow. Somewhere in the distance, a rumble cut through the silence. Headlights. A truck slowing down. The sound of boots crunching toward me. Then nothing. When I opened my eyes, everything was white again, but softer this time. Blankets, walls, hospital lights. A monitor beeped somewhere near my head. My fingers were bandaged. My skin burned and tingled. I wasn't dead, but I wasn't alive either. The doctor said hypothermia. The nurse said miracle. I said nothing. I lay there listening to the wind howling outside the window, the same wind that had tried to take me. I wondered if he even knew I was gone, or if he was sleeping soundly beside the woman he had been texting when he thought I wasn't looking. 12 years of loyalty, discarded like winter's first snowfall. I should have cried, but tears wouldn't come. My body had forgotten how to feel. That night had taken everything: warmth, love, dignity. But it had left me one thing I didn't know I possessed. A kind of stillness. Not the gentle kind that comforts. The dangerous kind that waits. The one that sharpens you quietly from the inside out. I could feel it already, pulsing beneath my skin like a second heartbeat. The doctor said I survived by luck. They were wrong. I survived because something inside me refused to die, something colder, quieter, more patient than the snow outside. That was the night Clara Morgan ceased to exist as she once was. The woman who begged, who believed, who trusted. She froze out there under the black sky. What rose in her place was someone else entirely. Someone who didn't need warmth anymore. Someone who had learned how to live inside the cold. That was the night everything froze. And that was the night revenge was born. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. I spent 3 days staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks like constellations, trying to remember how breathing used to feel. Every time I blinked, I saw snow, endless, merciless, swallowing everything. Nurses came and went, their smiles too bright, their words too soft, like they were trying to convince me the world was still kind. But kindness had become a language I no longer understood. On the 4th morning, I woke to a ray of sunlight sliding across my face. For a brief second, I almost believed it meant something. Then I saw the empty chair beside my bed. He hadn't come. Not a call. Not a flower. Not even a note. 12 years of marriage reduced to silence. The doctor said I could leave soon. I nodded, but my mind was far away, back to that night, back to the sound of the door closing behind me. I tried to replay his voice in my head, but it was blank. My brain had erased it, the way fire erases paper. When I was discharged, I walked out into the brittle daylight wrapped in a hospital coat and borrowed boots. Frostvale looked the same as always, quiet, polished, pretending. Couples walked hand in hand, children threw snowballs, smoke curled from chimneys like lazy ghosts. No one looked twice at me. Maybe I blended into the scenery too well now. Just another frozen soul drifting through a frozen town. I took a bus home. Or rather, to what used to be home. The driver avoided my eyes when I told him the address. People always do that when they sense something broken but can't name it. When the bus stopped, I hesitated before stepping off. The house looked smaller. The curtains drawn, the lights dim. My house, my memories, my laughter, all trapped behind those walls. I walked up the path, my hands trembling, not from the cold, but from the pull of habit. For 12 years, that doorknob had meant safety. Now it felt like a trap. I tried the key. It didn't fit. I tried again. Nothing. A hollow sound escaped me, something between a sigh and a laugh. He had changed the locks. Then I saw them. My clothes stuffed into black garbage bags, lined neatly beside the mailbox like offerings to the gods of humiliation. Each bag had a label in his handwriting. Bedroom, kitchen, personal. The neatness made it worse. Even his cruelty had order. Through the frosted glass of the living room window, I saw movement. A shape. Then two. Laughter floated out, muffled but sharp. A woman stepped into view, setting down a cup of coffee on the table I had picked out years ago. Lydia, his assistant. The one with the bright smile and the perfume that lingered too long. The rumors I'd brushed off suddenly felt like nails hammering into my chest. For a long moment, I just stood there staring. My breath fogged the glass. Inside, Daniel brushed a stray hair off Lydia's shoulder and said something that made her laugh harder. That sound, that laugh, it pierced straight through me. I didn't cry. I didn't knock. I just turned around and walked away. Each step felt heavy, but also deliberate, as if my body had decided something before my mind caught up. I checked into a cheap motel by the edge of town. The kind of place that smelled of damp carpet and lost stories. The man at the desk didn't ask questions. I liked that about him. The silence was easier to bear when no one tried to fill it. That night, I sat on the bed staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the one Daniel had married. Her eyes were darker, colder. There was no softness left to break. Something had shifted, quietly, completely. I thought about going to the police. I thought about calling a lawyer. But what would I say? That my husband threw me into the snow and replaced me like an old piece of furniture? Frostvale wasn't the kind of town that believed women like me. Daniel was respected, admired even. The perfect gentleman, the successful architect, the man who donated to charities and smiled at cameras. The kind of man everyone wanted to believe in. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. No one would fight for me. No one would care. So I stopped waiting for justice. Justice is something people in warm houses talk about. People who've never been left to die in the snow. Out here, survival has sharper edges. That night, I took a deep breath, folded my trembling hands, and whispered into the silence that I would never be powerless again. It wasn't a vow. It was a promise. When the cold wind rattled the windows, I didn't flinch. I looked straight into the darkness and let it in. I realized something simple, terrifying, and liberating all at once. The same cold that almost killed me could also keep me alive. From that night on, I didn't chase warmth. I studied the frost instead. Because frost doesn't lie. It shows you the truth when the fire burns everything else away. I learned the rhythm of Frostvale the way a prisoner learns the cadence of the guard's footsteps. I sat in the corner booth of a small cafe that smelled of burnt sugar and old newspapers, and I watched Daniel move through his days like a man who thought the world owed him comfort. He waved at the barista, he patted strangers on the back, he closed deals with a smile that had built his life. He did not know I existed anymore. That fact became my advantage. Revenge does not arrive as a lightning strike. It arrives as a slow frost, inching along a window pane until the whole glass is captured. I planted that frost deliberately. I took a job at the cafe under a different name. I chopped my hair short and learned to fold my face into something forgettable. Disappearance is a tool. People let you slip past them when you are small and dull. I watched the way Daniel favored certain tables, the way he always ordered the same drink, the way his fingers tapped impatience. Small patterns became maps. Every map reveals a path. I walked his path, traced his routines, and collected loose threads. He spoke loud enough sometimes in the presence of others about the city's upcoming projects, the new luxury complex that would change Frostvale's skyline. People nodded and clinked glasses. Themes of grandeur floated through rooms like smoke. I waited. The threads began to knot. A name here, a ledger there, a casual mention of a permit expedited with a nod. Nothing that would topple him alone. Everything that tied together made him less invincible. Cooper's name surfaced in fragments. A ghost in accounting, a man who knew more than he should and who disappeared the way small things do when they threaten large ones. I followed the trail through whispers and cold stares, through back alleys of municipal records and coffee-stained notebooks. Cooper had been meticulous, the sort who wrote down inconvenient truths. His absence had not been noticed by those who mattered until the foundation began to wobble. I found Ellen at a laundromat with a baby on her hip and a stack of unpaid bills balanced on her knee. Her face had been hollowed by worry and nights with no sleep. She did not know how to look at me without suspicion, a reflex born from so many people who promise help and disappear. I put my hand on her shoulder, offered a steadiness she did not expect. I told her pieces of what I knew without fanfare. She wanted vengeance like a starving thing wants bread, but she lacked the weapon. She had loss, I had method. We blended into an alliance built of need. We started small and legal. Freedom's most effective mask is routine. Ellen found employment records I could not access, Cooper's old folders that said things in blunt ink. I copied ledgers, glanced at notary seals, found names of inspectors who had been paid to look away. I learned how to speak to journalists without saying my name. An anonymous tip with concrete evidence cuts faster than rumor. Papers smelled of ink and ambition, so I fed them what they craved, proof. The first article was clinical, the second less so, and the town that loved its golden sun began to frown. While the newspapers undermined his image, I worked the bureaucracy. I sat in planning boards pretending to be a concerned citizen. I listened to developers chatter outside the courthouse. I learned the exact phrasing that made lawyers flinch. Legal language is a fortress. I learned how to aim for the keystone and watch the arch tremble. Daniel had invested in people willing to cut corners for profit. Those corners became a net. I tightened it thread by patient thread. There were nights I almost let emotion make the work sloppy. There were nights when the memory of standing outside, lips blue, hands numb, threatened to overwhelm me. I would picture the warm light in our living room, the cup of coffee steaming in the window where she now sat, and the image would sharpen my focus rather than soften it. The fury that once roared became a steady current, measured and precise. Revenge needs patience more than passion. Passion burns quickly and leaves you cold sooner. Ellen and I moved like conspirators of necessity. She showed me files sealed away in Cooper's old desk. I scanned, copied, and rearranged facts into a narrative that could not be dismissed as spite. I learned to be invisible in meetings, to smile in the right places, to send documents discreetly to people who wanted scandals as much as we wanted justice. The town's gossip mechanism, once a defense for Daniel, turned into a weapon against him. People who had swallowed favors for years started whispering in corners, remembering slights, pieces of evidence collecting like snowdrifts. There were moments when guilt touched my shoulder, a cold, familiar pressure. I thought about forgiveness because it's the script readers expect. Forgiveness was a luxury I once used like perfume to smooth edges. It no longer sat comfortably on me. Instead, I nurtured the cold clarity that kept me awake and purposeful. That clarity taught me to see Daniel not as a fallen lover, but as a man whose safety depended on deceit. Removing that safety was not petty. It was correction. By the time the first formal complaint was filed, I had built a lattice of proof that even the town's most loyal could not ignore. It did not feel like victory when the paperwork left my hands. It felt like setting a trap with careful knots tied, then stepping back to watch the mechanism work. My heart beat steadily, not with the panic that had dragged me into the snow, but with the quiet beat of someone who knows a storm is coming and is ready to survive it. Revenge had taken root in me the way ice roots in a river. It was patient, inevitable, and faithful to the rules of cold. It had no desire to be cruel beyond purpose. It wanted balance. It wanted him to understand the weight of what he had done. It wanted him to feel the absence he had given me. I planted that seed and tended it with a gardener's care, knowing full well that a seed, once grown, often takes a life of its own. Spring light came thin and dishonest after a winter that had felt endless. People smiled in town as if the thaw fixed everything, as if warmth could stitch back what cold had snapped. I watched them from the cafe window, tracing the small happy movements that used to mean everything to me. Daniel kept pretending too, polishing his smile for cameras and ribbon cuttings, offering selfies to neighbors who clung to the version of him that fit their Sunday sermons. The cracks were there, though, like hairline fractures in a mirror, barely visible until the light hits them just right. I kept working my maps, following the seams that led away from his glossy public face into the mess he had buried. The files I had, and the files Ellen turned over, weren't dramatic at first. Paperwork rarely is dramatic. Scandals are built from tiny lies that pile up like sediment until the weight becomes undeniable. I learned to read the sediment. The notarized pages that didn't match signatures, the permits stamped before inspections were finished, invoices with numbers that danced when someone looked for them. People who hoarded power do so by teaching others to be afraid. Once they fear the fall, they stop asking how high they were building. I started spending time in places that mattered to him, the planning office, the charity board meetings, the architecture guild that he used as a stage. I sat quietly at the back and learned to listen without looking like I was listening. You can learn more about a person by watching what they hide than by watching what they show. I listened as men spoke in clipped sentences about deadlines and clients, and I stored names that seemed unremarkable until they weren't. Names that would, in time, become a ledger of culpability. There was a humor to the stupidity I found, a dark amusement in how carelessly they assumed their safe spaces. A developer bragged about how easy it was to push a permit through with the right envelope. A contractor joked about saving money by using cheaper materials where the camera never went. The room laughed. The laughter tasted like the same cheap wine Daniel used to bring home to impress guests. I smiled softly, the kind of smile that means I understand exactly how fragile their scaffolding is. The town began to murmur. Not loudly, that would have been childish noise, but in the way snow shifts before an avalanche, in the subtle clicks of people changing their routines. A client pulled out of a project, citing new concerns. A supplier demanded receipts that suddenly mattered more than they had last week. I watched the dominoes fall not because I wished them harm, but because each one stripped him of the illusion he had built, the illusion he hid behind while he treated people like disposable tools. Daniel tried to stay above it with press statements and rehearsed sorrow. He moved through interviews like an actor reciting lines he had learned by heart. The press wanted spectacle, and he wanted to give them one. He spoke about mistakes and oversight, the kind of words that look like regret if no one checks the ledger. People like him are clever enough to appear human, but they forget how thin that appearance is when someone pulls at a single stitch. I pulled. Ellen became less fragile as the weeks passed. The shock that had hollowed her out at first hardened into a kind of iron resolve. She started showing up in city hearings, asking plain questions that made officials shift uneasily. She did not accuse with theatrical fury. She asked about dates and forms, the quiet technicalities that cannot be waved away with charm. Watching her stand there felt like watching the tide turning. The water was lifting at last, and the things it exposed were not elegant. There were nights when I still felt the phantom cold in my bones, a residual echo of the night that had changed everything. Those nights were raw and sharp, and sometimes I laughed at the absurd poetry of it all. He had been so sure that the night he cast me out would bury me. The universe had a darker sense of symmetry and had dug an equal grave later, one that took its time and left space for witnesses. The strategy was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a slow exposing, a stripping that let others decide what to do when the truth stood up and showed its plain face. I took care not to become a monster dressed in justice's clothes. There was a hunger in me that had to be fed, and I fed it with precision. The kind of precision that is almost clinical in its calm. You learn to be clinical when emotion once burned everything you loved. As public inquiries advanced and his allies began to distance themselves, Daniel's face grew thinner. The man who once filled rooms now looked like a sketch someone forgot to finish. There was a terrible grace in his unraveling, an artistry none of us wanted to applaud. He tried to bargain in small ways, phone calls through a lawyer and sympathetic notes passed by distant friends. I left every message unanswered. Silence is heavier than any accusation. Silence presses on the chest in a way words never can. When the first arrest warrant was threatened, the town held its breath in a way I had not seen since the old factory closed. Neighborhoods that once opened doors for him pulled curtains instead. He stood on the porch of his life and watched as the crowd that had once applauded turned their faces away. There is a moment in any downfall where the person who falls understands the cost too late, when the shock of losing everything outstrips the defenses that held them upright. I watched that moment with a steady, quiet attention. The cracks in his world did not look like retribution. They looked like consequences. The city had rules and people who, when pressed, preferred to follow paper over personalities. I had placed the pressure properly, and the weight of the system did what systems do. It crushed what had been built on shaky ground. In that slow collapse, there was a terrible beauty. It was not the kind that grants peace. It was the kind that forces truth into daylight and leaves everyone to reckon with the cold they had tolerated. Winter crept back like an old debt collector. The wind clawed through the alleys, and the lake froze solid enough to hold its breath again. People wrapped themselves in scarves and small talk, pretending the cold was seasonal, not personal. For me, it was familiar company. Frostvale looked the same as it had the night I nearly died, only this time, I was the one who had learned to survive the freeze. Daniel was unraveling. I could see it in the papers first. Headlines that once praised his vision now asked uncomfortable questions. He denied everything with practiced ease, the tone of a man used to being believed. He walked through reporters with that same half-smile, but the eyes gave him away. They flickered like candles in a draft. Behind that composure was fear, the kind that doesn't show until it's too late. I followed the story from my apartment above the cafe, sitting by the window where the frost gathered thick each morning. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had the fire once, and I had the cold. Now it was the other way around. Every article that exposed another thread of his corruption felt like a log added to the fire burning quietly in my chest. I didn't need to shout or confront him. The world was doing it for me, and I had guided its hand. One evening, I stepped outside into the kind of snow that fell in sheets, heavy and endless. I walked past his office building, its grand sign dim under the flickering streetlights. Only one window was lit, the top floor his. The rest of the city had gone home. He was alone, probably pacing, probably drinking the same brandy he used to offer guests to mask insecurity with luxury. I stood across the street and watched the reflection of that light on the snow, remembering the last time I'd seen his house glowing behind me as I froze in the dark. This time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt patient. The cafe's owner closed early during blizzards, so I had the streets to myself. I imagined walking up to his door again, the same door that once shut me out. I wondered if I would find him behind it still pretending, still denying, still building castles out of lies. But I didn't go. Revenge is not about repetition, it's about transformation. I didn't want to become the echo of that night. I wanted to be the consequence of it. A week later, his lawyer released a statement. The words were dry, professional, carefully structured to sound like confidence while saying nothing. It mentioned allegations, review processes, and temporary leave. I almost laughed when I read it. The mighty Daniel Morgan stepping aside temporarily. The city took it as dignity. I knew it was defeat disguised as delay. The real blow came quietly. Lydia's name surfaced in court records as a cooperating witness. She had vanished from Frostvale months ago, but her testimony appeared in ink, clean and damning. Daniel had traded her for convenience, and she had returned the favor with precision. I didn't need to lift a finger for that one. Fate handles its own accounting sometimes. People who had once worshipped him began to rewrite their stories. They said they'd always suspected something, that they never really liked the way he flaunted his success. Frostvale is quick to forget its idols when they fall. They erased him in conversations the way snow erases footprints. It was poetic, really. The same town that had turned its back on me was now turning its back on him. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was symmetry. On a Friday morning, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single page, a copy of the foreclosure notice on his home. The house where he had thrown me into the cold now belonged to the bank. I placed the letter on my table, watched the morning light catch the embossed stamp, and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't joy. Joy was for the innocent. It was something deeper, colder. The weight of balance restored. That night, I walked to the edge of town. The snow was falling again, thick and soundless. From the hill, I could see the distant flicker of his old mansion, now dark, lifeless, windows boarded. For the first time, it looked like what it truly was, a hollow monument to arrogance. I stood there until the cold began to sting my skin, then longer still, until the sting turned into calm. The air tasted sharp, the same metallic taste of that night long ago. Only this time, I was not the victim shivering in the snow. I was the witness to the reckoning. They say storms come to cleanse. Maybe that's true. Or maybe storms come to remind us that warmth is borrowed, and cold is eternal. Either way, the storm had returned, and I wasn't afraid of it anymore. The man who once told me to freeze had finally learned what that meant. And the winter, in its merciless way, was only getting started. The town started whispering long before the headlines caught up. Frostvale has a way of spreading rumors the same way frost spreads across glass, thin, quiet, unstoppable. Everywhere I went, I heard fragments of Daniel's fall dressed in gossip. People said his accounts were frozen, that Lydia had taken what little money he had left and fled the country. Others said the government had seized his property, that his company was nothing more than a pile of cold paper and broken promises. It didn't matter what was true. What mattered was that no one believed in him anymore. I didn't hide from the noise. I sat in that same cafe, the one where he used to hold meetings, and let it wash over me like music. The regulars talked freely around me, never realizing I was part of the story. They laughed about his arrogance, about how the mighty always think the ice beneath them won't crack. They joked that maybe he should have treated people better. I smiled faintly into my cup, stirring the coffee that had gone cold long ago. There was a cruel poetry in the way things had come full circle. Justice, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the mouths of strangers. But beneath that quiet satisfaction was a different feeling, something hollow. I told myself it was exhaustion, the release after years of holding my breath. But deep down it felt like a void. When revenge becomes the reason you wake up every morning, you forget who you were before it started. And when it finally ends, you're left with silence that's too wide to cross. The papers called it the Frostvale scandal. Each day, new details leaked, documents I had sent months ago, evidence Ellen had uncovered, testimonies from people who finally found the courage to speak. It all spilled into the public like melted ice, unstoppable once the first crack appeared. The local station replayed footage of him being escorted out of his office. No handcuffs, just humiliation in a dark coat and trembling hands. The man who once looked untouchable now looked painfully human. I thought I would feel triumph. I didn't. What I felt was something else, an eerie calm, the kind that comes after a storm flattens a forest. I had won, but in winning, I'd also lost the person I had been before he threw me out that door. Some nights, I couldn't sleep. I would sit by the window, watching snow drift past the streetlights, thinking about how much of myself I had fed to the fire of vengeance. I remembered the woman who once believed in love, in warmth, in fairness. She was gone now, and I wasn't sure I wanted her back. She had been too gentle for this world, too trusting. The woman I had become didn't cry anymore. She calculated. She didn't hope, she planned. A journalist came into the cafe one day, talking loudly about the story that had made her career. She mentioned me without knowing it. The anonymous source. The ghost who had handed her the truth on a silver platter. She said she hoped the woman behind it was sleeping peacefully at night. I almost laughed. Peace is for people who can forget. I remember everything. Ellen called me once after the verdict went public. She didn't say much, just that she could finally afford groceries again. Her voice trembled between grief and relief. I told her I was glad, and I meant it. For her, the story ended there. For me, it didn't. I still walked with a cold. It had become part of me, the same cold he had used against me, now reshaped into armor. I heard that Daniel tried to reach out. Letters, calls, messages through friends. He wanted to talk, to explain, maybe even to beg. I never replied. What could he say that would matter now? There are no words that thaw betrayal. Silence was the only language left between us. The last time I saw him was on a news clip. He was walking down the courthouse steps, surrounded by cameras. The wind tore through his coat, and his hair was unkempt, his face pale. For a moment, I thought he looked straight into the lens and saw me, not literally, but in that way where a person suddenly realizes what they've created. The fear in his eyes wasn't of punishment. It was of recognition. He finally understood the kind of cold that never ends. That night, Frostvale was hit by a snowstorm, the worst in years. I walked home through it slowly, feeling the flakes sting my cheeks. Around me, the town shivered and hid, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. The wind roared, and I whispered into it without sound, telling the storm it had nothing left to take from me. Daniel's empire had burned to ash, but my revenge was never about fire. Fire fades. It's beautiful but brief. My revenge was made of frost, steady, silent, and permanent. They say time heals everything, but they forget that ice preserves. It keeps things exactly as they are. And as the storm howled outside, I realized I had become the storm itself, the quiet destruction no one sees coming until it's too late. Winter deepened, swallowing Frostvale in white silence. The streets grew narrower under snowdrifts, the sky stayed gray for weeks, and the town's rhythm slowed to a dull heartbeat. Everyone stayed indoors when the temperature dropped past reason. Everyone except me. I liked walking then, feeling the air so sharp it could carve. The cold didn't hurt anymore. It was just proof that I still existed. Daniel's world was shrinking in the same way the daylight did, hour by hour, degree by degree. His friends stopped returning calls, his investors pretended they'd never shaken his hand, and his name became a cautionary tale whispered over bar counters. He was a ghost long before he realized it. The last I heard, he had sold his penthouse in the city and moved to a cabin outside town, something cheap, isolated, hidden behind pines that never shed their snow. The man who once ruled every room was now learning how small a single room could be. I visited the outskirts once, curious. The road there twisted like a memory that didn't want to be found. The air was thick with fog and with smoke, and when I reached the cabin, the windows were coated with frost from the inside. Through the haze, I could see a dim light flickering, not steady like a lamp, but uneven, desperate. A shadow moved behind the curtain, pacing, restless. It was him. I didn't knock. I didn't even step closer. I just watched from the trees as he poured another drink and stared at the wall like he was waiting for something to answer back. His movements were slower, heavier, like the weight of his own name had finally caught up to him. There was no grandeur left in him, no charm, no fight. Just a man sinking into the cold he once commanded. I stayed there until my toes went numb. Then, quietly, I placed something at the edge of his porch, a small photograph, the one from our honeymoon in Santorini. We were smiling, the sun in our eyes, the sea behind us. I had folded the corner neatly and written 3 words on the back: Some winter's return. Then I walked away, letting the wind cover my footprints. The next morning, I heard what happened. A neighbor found him slumped in his chair, the fire dead, the heater broken, the room colder than the world outside. They said he'd been drinking for days. They said he hadn't eaten. They said the frost had crept across his skin like lace before anyone reached him. The police called it an accident. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. When I read the news, I felt no rush of victory, no spark of satisfaction. Just stillness. The kind that sits in the chest and refuses to move. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, thought it would feel like the closing of a wound. But revenge doesn't close anything. It simply trades pain for quiet. That night, I went back to the hill overlooking the cabin. The snow had settled into smooth perfection, untouched and endless. Somewhere beneath that blanket, the man who once left me to freeze was now frozen himself. The symmetry was obscene and perfect. The same cold that had once taken me to the edge had now taken him completely. I stood there for a long time, staring at the faint wisp of smoke rising from the chimney where the last ember must have died. The air smelled of pine and ash. The forest was silent except for the sound of branches creaking under their own weight. It felt less like an ending and more like the earth exhaling after holding its breath for too long. For the first time in years, I cried. Not for him. Not even for me. I cried because the storm inside me had nothing left to destroy. The cold had completed its circle, and I didn't know what came after. Back in town, they spoke kindly of him. Frostvale always forgives its dead. They said he was a good man who lost his way, a victim of circumstance, of stress, of betrayal. They wrapped his sins in soft language so they could sleep at night. No one asked about the woman he left in the snow years ago. No one ever does. The world prefers tidy stories with neat endings. I didn't attend the funeral. I didn't need to. I visited the cemetery a week later when the mourners were gone and the flowers had frozen to the soil. His grave sat near the edge, the headstone simple and gray. The ground around it was smooth, except for one mark, the imprint of the photo I had left. The wind must have carried it there. It felt like the universe tying its own knot. I knelt, not out of pity, but out of habit, the way you do when you stand at the border between past and present. The frost bit my knees, but I didn't move. I whispered nothing. There were no words left worth saying. I just let the silence speak, because silence had always been the truest language between us. As I stood and turned to leave, the snow began again, soft at first, then heavy. It blanketed the ground, the graves, the world. Within minutes, everything was white again. Clean. Erased. Frostvale was good at erasing. And somewhere under all that white, he was finally as cold as the night he'd made for me. Days blurred after that. The storm came and went, leaving the town heavy and muted. People shoveled their driveways, children built snowmen that leaned sideways, and shopkeepers scraped frost from their windows as if routine could bury the scandal. Frostvale moved on quickly, it always did. The world doesn't stop spinning just because someone's story ends, it only hesitates, then carries on as if nothing happened. I stayed in the cafe for a while, out of habit more than comfort. The same seat by the window, the same chipped mug that never quite got clean. Outside, the world looked washed of color. Even the light seemed tired. People talked less about Daniel now, though his name still hung like smoke in old conversations. Sometimes I caught strangers lowering their voices when I walked by, not because they knew who I was, but because guilt has a way of recognizing itself. I read about the auction of his belongings in the local paper. The furniture sold cheap. The paintings went to collectors who didn't care about the stories behind them. Even his car, a sleek black machine he used to polish every Sunday, ended up at a dealership downtown. Frostvale was good at stripping the dead of their glamour. By spring, there was nothing left of him but headlines and whispers. I thought I'd feel lighter when it was over, but weight doesn't always disappear, it changes shape. The revenge that had kept me breathing for so long no longer had a purpose. It was like standing in an empty room that still smelled faintly of fire. I wandered through my days like someone who'd forgotten how to want. The silence that once soothed me began to feel too loud, echoing in corners I couldn't reach. At night, I dreamed of snow. Not the violent kind, but soft, endless snowfall covering everything. In those dreams, I was neither cold nor warm. I simply existed in the quiet, waiting for something that never came. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of wind still howling in my ears. One morning, I decided to walk to the cemetery again. The air was sharp, but the sun was out, a rare combination in Frostvale. I followed the familiar path past the frozen creek and through the line of birch trees that bent toward each other like old mourners. His grave was easy to find. The snow had melted just enough to reveal his name, carved deep into stone, letters already darkened by frost. Someone had left flowers. Lilies, white as bone. Maybe Lydia. Maybe someone else looking for redemption in the wrong place. I stood there, hands in my pockets, the cold wind slicing across my face. There was no hatred left, no satisfaction either. Just a faint hum inside me, a recognition that endings aren't neat. They bleed. They echo. I didn't speak, but if I could have said anything, it would have been this. You taught me the cold, but you never learned how to live in it. I turned and started walking back toward town. The snow crunched beneath my boots, each step steady, deliberate. A dog barked in the distance, a train horn moaned somewhere beyond the hills. Life kept making noise, indifferent and unstoppable. That night, I packed my things. The apartment above the cafe had served its purpose. It had been a place to hide, to heal, to sharpen. Now it was just another room filled with ghosts. I looked around one last time before locking the door. The walls were bare, the air still smelled faintly of coffee and frost. I left the key on the counter. As I stepped outside, a gust of wind caught my hair, lifting it for a moment before letting it fall. I tilted my face to the sky. Snowflakes drifted down, slow, patient, deliberate. Each one a fragment of silence. I thought about how the cold had once been my enemy, how it had taken everything from me. Now, it felt almost like a companion. It didn't hurt anymore, it just existed, the way I did. Revenge had run its course. What came after wasn't joy or peace, it was something simpler, quieter. A strange kind of freedom built from ruin. I didn't forgive him, and I didn't need to. Some things aren't meant to be forgiven, they're meant to be survived. When I reached the edge of town, I didn't look back. Frostvale would keep its stories, its ghosts, its snow. I had my own now. And somewhere in the wind, I could almost hear a faint whisper, the echo of that night, the sound of the door closing, the silence that followed. Only this time, it didn't sound like the end. It sounded like beginning again. Spring came with reluctant grace, as if the earth itself feared warmth after so much cold. The snow melted in uneven patches, leaving behind puddles that reflected the gray sky like shattered mirrors. Frostvale looked wounded but alive again. Trees that had stood brittle for months began to tremble with the faintest signs of green, hesitant and unsure. I understood that feeling. I had left the cafe, left the apartment, and moved into a small studio near the edge of town. It was nothing special, one window, one creaky bed, one kettle that whistled like it was complaining about being alive. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I could hear silence without feeling cornered by it. The cold that used to invade me from the outside now lived quietly inside, tamed and obedient. It no longer demanded revenge. It just reminded me of who I had been and what I had survived. I started painting again. Not because I wanted to, but because my hands didn't know what else to do. At first, the canvases were just colorless swirls, the kind that looked like the sky before a storm. But slowly, shapes began to emerge. A cracked teacup, a window frosted on one side, a woman walking barefoot through snow. Every brushstroke felt like reclaiming a piece of something I didn't realize I'd lost. The local gallery owner saw one of my paintings in a thrift shop window. I had traded it for groceries and asked to buy more. I said no at first. My work wasn't meant for walls. It was meant to exorcise ghosts. But he insisted. A month later, I had an exhibition. People walked through the gallery murmuring about the emotional tension and silent grief of my pieces. They didn't know they were looking at the anatomy of revenge, frozen in paint. They clapped politely when I spoke about healing through art. I said the words they wanted to hear. Healing. Resilience. Renewal. The kind of words that sound nice in a brochure. The truth was simpler and darker. You don't heal from something like that. You adapt. You grow around it like a tree swallowing a nail. The scar stays. You just stop bleeding. Some evenings, I'd sit on the steps outside the studio watching people walk by. Couples holding hands. Children dragging sticks through puddles. Laughter drifting through the thawing air. It didn't hurt the way it used to. It didn't make me jealous. It just felt distant, like a song I once knew the words to but couldn't hum anymore. Sometimes I thought about him, not often, but enough. His face had started to blur in my memory. The sharpness was gone, the details fading. Only fragments remained, a tone of voice, a scent, a shadow standing too close. I didn't miss him. What I missed was the version of myself that existed before him. The woman who believed that love was enough to keep someone warm through winter. I could never be her again. One evening, a woman approached me after the gallery closed. She was around my age, bundled in a wool coat, eyes cautious but kind. She told me she had recognized me, that she used to work in Daniel's office years ago. My body tensed, a reflex I hadn't felt in months. But her voice wasn't sharp, it was soft. She said she was sorry. Not for what he'd done, but for not seeing it sooner. For believing the version of him that everyone wanted to believe. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I just nodded. I wasn't angry. I couldn't be. Everyone wants to believe in warmth until they get burned. When she left, I walked to the riverbank. The ice had cracked open, the water moving sluggishly beneath. I stood there for a long time, listening to it murmur. The sound reminded me of my own pulse, faint but steady. There are moments when you realize that survival is not about winning. It's about endurance. It's about learning to live with the parts of you that the storm didn't take. I knelt by the river, dipped my hand into the cold water, and let it sting. It wasn't punishment anymore. It was acknowledgement. A baptism of sorts, one that didn't erase the past but accepted it. The current brushed past my skin and kept going, indifferent to everything it carried. As I walked back to my studio, the streetlights flickered on. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and smoke. Somewhere, a radio played an old song about love and loss, the melody fragile and familiar. I didn't turn it off. For the first time, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own story. I was the one writing it now, one steady, deliberate brushstroke at a time. The thaw had come, slow and uneven. But it had come. Years slipped by like melting ice, quietly, without ceremony. The world kept moving, softening at the edges, but part of me stayed frozen in that night, in the hush before the storm, in the last breath before the door closed. Time heals nothing. It just teaches you how to live with the scar. I left Frostvale not long after the exhibition. The town had grown smaller somehow, as if I had outgrown its silence. I found a cottage by the sea, far from the snowfields that had shaped me. The winters here were gentler. The cold came with salt in the air instead of bitterness, and the sea wind sang instead of howled. It was the kind of place people came to forget. I didn't come to forget, I came to remember quietly. The mornings were soft. I'd make tea, open the window, and watch the horizon bruise from blue to gold. The sound of waves became my clock. Every day looked the same, and that sameness was a strange kind of peace. The world here didn't know Daniel Morgan or the scandal or the woman who froze and came back colder. Here, I was just Clara. Just a woman with paint-stained fingers and a past no one asked about. My paintings changed again. The frost faded from them. Now they were mostly water and light, with streaks of gray hidden underneath, reminders, not confessions. People said they felt hope in them. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was just the illusion of it. Sometimes hope is only the shadow of endurance seen in better light. At night, when the air turned cold and the sea hissed against the rocks, I would stand by the window and watch frost form along the glass. It always started the same way, a single crystal spreading like veins across the surface, delicate and merciless. I'd trace it with my fingertip until it melted beneath my warmth, only for it to form again moments later. It reminded me of him. Of us. Of what the cold gives and what it takes. I don't think about revenge anymore. That word belongs to another lifetime. What I did wasn't vengeance, not really. It was balance, the universe correcting its weight. I didn't kill him. The cold did. I just stopped shielding him from it. Sometimes, when the wind rises and the air outside turns sharp, I imagine him sitting across from me in that same storm, the distance between us still filled with frost. There's no anger left, no triumph. Just an understanding that cruelty has its own gravity, and what you throw into the dark eventually circles back. I walk by the shore most evenings now, where the waves leave salt patterns that look like frost on the sand. I pick up driftwood, smooth and pale, shaped by years of being battered by water and time. There's a beauty in that, how something can survive the endless rhythm of loss and still look whole. Maybe that's what I became. Not healed, not redeemed, just reshaped. The neighbors think I'm quiet, distant, the kind of woman who keeps too many thoughts and too few friends. They're not wrong. Solitude stopped feeling lonely a long time ago. It's just a language I speak fluently now. The nights here are darker than frost veils, but the stars are closer. Sometimes I sit on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching my breath cloud the air, feeling that familiar sting of cold on my skin. It no longer feels like punishment. It feels like a reminder that I survived it once, and it never truly left. When people ask what happened to me before I came here, I tell them I moved away from the snow. It's true in a way. I just don't tell them that the snow still lives inside me. As the first frost of winter creeps across the window, I watch it spread and catch the light of the rising moon. It's beautiful, the way ice can glow without warmth. For a moment, I see my reflection there, older now, steadier, still marked by the cold, but no longer consumed by it. The story ended long ago, but its echo lingers, soft as breath against glass. I smile faintly and sip my tea. Some stories end in fire. Mine ended in ice. And maybe that's why it never really ended at all. If this story moved you, please don't forget to give it a like. And if you love emotional, powerful stories like this one, please make sure to subscribe to the channel.